and it's a great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Thomas Schestag, who is a professor of German studies here at Brown. Thomas's writings, many of them in German, strike the reader that I am by their compact, dense, and I would say almost terse titles, often one word, completed by a name or a series of names. Asphalt, Walter Benjamin, published by Klaus Böhr Verlag, 1992, on Walter Benjamin's theory of language. Para, Lucretius Hebel Ponge, published by also Klaus Böhr Verlag, 1991, on literary hermeneutics. Mantis Relicte, published by Urs Engeler, 1999, on mantics, semantics, focusing on the figure of the praying mantis in Jean-Henri Fabre, Maurice Blanchot, and Paul Celan. It is actually partly translated, I think, in English in a special issue of French Yale Studies. That's right, dedicated to Blanchot. Thomas's more recent books add to this, I would say, almost ascetic quality of his title, the absence sometimes of capital letters. For example, Namenlose, with a lowercase n, published by Mattes und Seitz, 2019, where Thomas goes back to the question of names, and this time through the name of Odysseus and through Kafka's strange being, call it being, Odradek. Thomas's latest book, simply and beautifully titled Philia, also with a lowercase p, was published last April, I believe, by Mattes und Seitz, and it is a fascinating meditation on philology and love. The title of Thomas's talk today is Purloin, Purloin, Rousseau and Poe. Please join me in welcoming Thomas.
First of all, thank you to Peter for your kind introduction, but also for the invitation, no less kind, to participate in this event and to approach the question, for whom do we read, from more or less far? What if no reading of so-called given texts could avoid taking away something from the text under consideration? And what if such a takeaway took the shape, viewed from a certain angle, of theft? A thieving reading, or lecture voleuse, a theft aimed not at taking possession of that which had been taken away, but rather aimed at nothing other than experiencing the pain or pleasure of such an éloignement, the experience of away. To purloin, pour loin. How to measure, if at all, and for whom, the implications for what is called reading and the extent of such an event or eventuality. Along those questioning and questionable lines, I propose to take a closer look in what follows at 4 scenes of theft. 2 occur at the end of the first book of Rousseau's Confession, a third at the close of the second book, and the fourth emerges as an extension of the prior 3 in the theft of letters that hides in plain sight in Poe's short story, The Purloined Letter. Voila. This is, Rousseau admits near the end of the first book of Les Confessions, how I learned, and I quote from an English translation by J.M. Cohen from 1953, to covert in silence, to conceal, to dissimulate, to lie, and finally to steal. Et à dérober, enfin. To withdraw something from someone or from somewhere, as if theft were the quintessence and embodiment of the preceding vices. And Rousseau adds, an idea that had never before come into my head, fantaisie qui jusqu'alors ne m'était pas venue. The idea to steal, that is to withdraw, had been up to that moment withdrawn from my mind. Far, removed, éloigné. Now it came close, not just to visit, but to stay with me. Quote, an idea that had never before come into my head and of which I have never quite been able to cure myself since, et dont je n'ai pu depuis lors bien me guérir. This fantasy of fancy, of inconspicuous pilfering came close, so close in fact, that it infested me, inhabiting me ever since. Without any chance for me to find a remedy that would have helped to extricate the vice, the drive or desire to withdraw, which theft embodies, from my body, mind, and soul. I confess I was and still remain unable to withdraw myself from the desire to withdraw. To confess that the desire to steal, including the pleasure to covert in silence, to conceal, to dissimulate, and to lie, never completely left me since its first approach, cast a certain clair-obscur over my confessions. For how can I confess to be a liar without lying when saying, I confess I'm a liar? As if something remained withdrawn or purloined from or into the surface of the text, as if the text invited the reader to withdraw from what seemed to be a given surface, to inconspicuously dig into its fore and back or underground, and to take, without any license granted, from there. The first scene of theft in question centers on apples. It is preceded and prepared by a sentence, the double entendre of which gets lost in translation. I quote from the English translation mentioned above. It is nearly always generous feelings misdirected that lead a child into taking his first step in crime. Unquote. The prefix mis in misdirected and crime are one but probably not the same in French, mal. I quote, ce sont presque toujours de bons sentiments mal dirigés qui font faire aux enfants le premier pas vers le mal. This child's first step toward le mal has been provoked by an apple, malum in Latin, a word which is the Latin homonym of malum, le mal, the vice or crime. The one word mal in Rousseau's Confession cuts the Latin apple, malum, in two halves. The first scene of theft will restage and complicate this splitting. The year is 1728, and the 14-year-old Rousseau is an apprentice in the workshop of Abel du Commun, maître graveur, an engraver in Geneva. Rousseau writes, one memory of an apple hunt, une chasse aux pommes, that cost me dear still makes me shudder and laugh at the same time. These apples were stashed away in his master's house, out of the apprentice's reach, at bottom of a cupboard, une dépense, almost jealously hidden from sight, but not from light, by a high lattice une jalousie élevée. Rousseau continues, one day when I was alone in the house, I climbed on the kneading trough to peer into this garden of the Hesperides at those precious fruits I could not touch. End quote. The French renders the fruit in the singular, ce précieux fruit dont je ne pouvais approcher. The precious apple was out of reach. The allusion to the garden of the Hesperides turns the apples into forbidden fruit and the intended theft into a Herculean task. The scene of theft, though, is also a scene of reading. Not the least because apples stored away in the dépense had been picked and collected. That is, in German, gelesen or aufgelesen. In other words, those apples had been read, collected. I wanted to reach through the lattice, à travers la jalousie, into the hidden space and reread, or rather to unread the collection by selecting and extracting just one apple from the stash. For whom does the thief read if not for that for which he longs, that which is already read and stashed away in order to reach for and withdraw at least of the fruits, one of the fruits withdrawn, to purloin one among the purloined fruits, unum malum. Rousseau describes his disposition thusly. I found myself withdrawn from what I wanted to withdraw. And this is how I read or read or tried to steal again in translation. Those precious fruits I could not touch, approcher. Then I went to fetch the spit to see if it would reach. It was too short. So I lengthened it, je l'allongeai, with one which was used for game. I probed several times, je piquai plusieurs fois, in vain. But at last I felt with delight, avec transport, that I was bringing up an apple. I raised it very gently and was just on the point of grasping it. End quote. But between the apple very gently raised and being at the brink of grasping it, the translator drops a third sentence. In French it says, déjà la pomme touchait à la jalousie. A sentence hard to grasp for, upon closer look, it splits in two. Already the apple touched the lattice, but also the apple already concerns jealousy. The jealousy in this case is also that of the filtering translator. For with his eyes the translator first probes, then carefully picks and lifts the French sentence, bringing it so close yet still too far away to grasp and hold it, trying to stash its meaning to the cupboard of the other language. But in doing so, at length, he lets fall the fruit. Nothing else will happen to the thief. I continue to quote from the English translation. What was my grief to find that the apple was too big to pass the lattice. I resorted to the most ingenious devices to get it through. I had to find supports to keep the spit in position, a knife long enough, un couteau assez long, to cut the apple in two, pour fondre la pomme, and the lath to hold it up. With time and perseverance, I managed to divide it. Je parvins à la partager, and was in hopes of then bringing the pieces through one after the other. But the moment they were apart, mais à peine furent-elles séparées, they both fell back into the cupboard. Qu'elles tombèrent toutes deux dans la dépense. Kind readers, sympathize with me in my grief. Lecteur pitoyable, partagez mon affliction. This passage, describing the thief's operation of splitting the apple in two, the French verb is partager, culminates in the definite loss of both halves of the fruit and in the syntactical cleaving of the passage through Rousseau's insertion of an address to the reader that employs the very same verb, partager. The translator confronting this obstacle must in turn cut into the French verb partager, which is too big an apple for his task. He first replaces partager as applied to the apple by divide, then renders partager as applied to the reader's shared affliction by sympathize. This operation brings to the fore semantic incompatibilities at play already in the French verb partager. They underline a strange complicity between the apple cut in two and a deal to be cut with the reader. That is, with the reader so close to hear, yet far away, of the thief's incisive or rather unreadings of apples already read, collected, stored away. To cut one fruit in two, partager, describes a distancing or taking apart. The address near the end implores the absent reader to do the opposite. To delete the distance, partager, share with me, sympathize. Partager is supposed to heal the wound it cuts. Its reappearance, though, at the end and as the end of this first scene of theft, undercuts the effort to overcome a certain éloignement, not only designated by the word partager, but to which that word, like any word, any apple, any reader, thief or theft, remains exposed. Éloignement, not of one word from another, but of what seemed to be a given word, however hidden, from itself. The second scene of theft occurs in a detailed meditation on Rousseau's relation to money. A summative statement precedes the account of the events. Rousseau writes, "If I did not become a real thief, un voleur en forme, a real or regular, no extraordinary thief, no thief out of the order, a thief in conformity with common expectations about how thieves are supposed to behave and to look like in order to be identified as thieves." And I continue, quote, "If I did not become a real thief, it is because I have never been much tempted by money." End quote. In the face of money, I stole away. I withheld from regular thievery because of my indifference to money. I kept my distance from the prospect of being a voleur en forme. In other words, when stealing, I never took shape as thief. The thief I learned to be, the thief I was and probably still am, had nothing in common with what is called a thief. Nor, one might add, the reader or unreader of stored away apples you just witnessed at work with what is called lecteur en forme, nor had my reading anything in common with what is called lecture en forme. The second scene of theft centers on reading. Stealing at first glance appears to be out of the picture, but only at first glance. During the time of his apprenticeship, Rousseau reaches a point at which he is bored of everything. Je m'ennuyais de tout. He writes, "In that state, I reacquired my love of reading, le goût de la lecture, which I had long ago lost." End quote. The taste for reading, which had been lost to busy work, perdu depuis longtemps, approached me again. It approached not just to visit me, but to stay and inhabit me. In other words, it occurred as a move indistinct from what was described earlier as the drive or desire to steal. I quote, "The time for books I stole from my work, des lectures prises sur mon travail," end quote. What I took, the liberty I took to read, what I took away from my working hours, the English translation is tempted to replace by the verb to steal, probably provoked by what follows. These readings took the shape of a new crime. Ces lectures devinrent un nouveau crime, prompting fresh punishments. This taste soon turned into passion, and passion into fury. Ce goût devint passion, bientôt fureur. Rousseau recounts his indiscriminate ardor in the following passage. I quote, "Madame la Tribu's famous landing library provided reading of all sorts. Good or bad was alike to me. Bon et mauvais, tout passait. I did not choose, I read everything with equal avidity. I read at my bench, I read on errands, I read in the lavatory." And the English translation skips the most important location, la garde-robe, where I forgot myself for hours on end. Je lisais à la garde-robe et m'y oubliais des heures entières. Reading in the garde-robe, I was dérobé, without guard, robbed of myself, par elle, par la lecture. If you want to know, to see what reading in the garde-robe might look like, you have to look at Peter Sandy's book, at the cover of Peter Sandy's Pouvoir de la lecture. Il y a une photographie de André Kertész. There's someone reading in the garde-robe. I continue to quote, "I read till my head spun, I did nothing but read. Je ne faisais plus que lire. My master spied on me, caught me, bet me, and took away my books. Me prenait mes livres. How many volumes were torn up, burned, and thrown out of the window? How many works returned to Madame la Tribu's shelves with volumes missing? When I had no money to pay her, I gave her my shirts, my ties, my clothes. My weekly pocket money of 3 sous was carried to her regularly every Sunday." For whom or what for did I read? This question suffers a certain twist in what follows, that is, 2 sentences folding theft and reading into one another in unexpected ways. I quote, "Reading had cut down every activity. La lecture m'eût ôté toute activité. Given over entirely to my new craze, livré tout entier à mon nouveau goût, I did nothing but read. I gave up stealing. Je ne faisais plus que lire, je ne volais plus." As if reading had utterly supplanted stealing. No more stealing, nothing but reading. But things turn out to be more complicated. For reading, in this case, becomes indistinct from stealing. Indeed, la lecture m'eût ôté could be translated as reading had removed me from all activity, had taken all activity away, had left me robbed of all activity. And indeed, a German translation renders ôter as rauben, to bereave, to rob. Reading, a robber or thief. La lecture, voleuse. The obstacle here is the word lecture. For the English term reading does not translate, does not relate, does not embody the equivalent of lecture. La lecture here shows up as an agent personifying a certain activity. It is an actor in the scene, une actrice. La lecture, elle, in what she did to me, had robbed me of all activity, including reading as an act or activity I would have been able to perform as expected from any lecteur en forme. The passage does not state that I was reading, but that reading, la lecture, took over. Its sole activity, not mine, but the one I endured as a passion, was to remove me from myself. My sole experience of reading was no longer mine. My experience was to be purloined. Not a purloined reader, but purloined from reading. Par elle, la lecture. Reading had robbed me of reading, drawn away from what may be called myself. La lecture m'eût ôté de moi-même. Reading, a former activity of mine, had turned into an experience of distancing to which I remained exposed, though no I remained exposed. The distancing took place without taking place, never ceasing to displace, to take away places without taking place between me and me. Some readers refer to the third scene of theft as the purloined ribbon episode. It takes place, although whether it takes place or not is an open question, near the end of the second book of Rousseau's Confessions, at the point of the dissolution of a household. The theft occurs at the point of rupture of a household in the literal sense of oikonomia, not without causing some confusion in the house, un peu de confusion dans la maison, including the almost inevitable displacement of various things, bien des choses, inside the house. Nothing was really found missing. Rien ne se trouva de manque. Nothing was not found, if not at its place, then at least, though displaced, withdrawn from itself. Except for one little thing. As Rousseau states, only Mademoiselle Pontal lost a little pink and silver ribbon, which was quite old. La seule Mademoiselle Pontal perdit un petit ruban couleur rose et argent déjà vieux. Rousseau's confession immediately follows the remembrance of this loss. I quote, "Plenty of better things were within my reach, but this ribbon alone tempted me. I stole it. And as I hardly troubled to conceal it, it was soon found. Beaucoup d'autres meilleures choses étaient à ma portée. Ce ruban seul me tenta. Je le volai. Et comme je ne le cachais guère, on me le trouva bientôt." The thief takes the ribbon, but doesn't take pains to find a concealed place for the stolen good. As if to place and to take possession of a place had no place in this particular thief's purview, that is, this particular reader's preoccupations. And I quote, "They inquired how I had got hold of it. I grew confused and finally said that it was Marion who had given it to me. On voulut savoir où je l'avais pris, je me trouble et enfin je dis que c'est Marion qui me l'a donné. Marion, a young and pretty girl from the Alpine region of Maurienne, taken in by Madame de Vercellis as her cook, is a person whom every member of the household considers as the embodiment of probity. An improvised trial takes place, in the course and aftermath of which the question of taking and occupying a place, of giving up a position under duress without finding another position, post or profession with which to identify or not, comes to the fore of the text, but not to be raised and placed, nor even replaced by an answer. At one point in the course of the interrogation, Rousseau repeats his accusation against Marion. I quote, declaring to her face that she had given me the ribbon. Je confirme ma déclaration et lui soutiens en face qu'elle m'a donné le ruban. Marion starts crying and addresses him in these words. Ah, Rousseau, I thought you were a good fellow, un bon caractère. You make me very sad, but I should not like to be in your place. Mais je ne voudrais pas être à votre place. But in whose place exactly? Marion seems to mean to say, I'd never switch places with you, Rousseau, for you are a thief and liar, and will bear the burden of wrong accusation all your life. Marion seems to be convinced that people occupy places and are characterized by the place they occupy. But in the trial's aftermath, Rousseau seems, in regard to Marion, equally preoccupied with the question of place, of being placed or replaced as a consequence of having been dismissed. And I quote, I do not know what happened to the victim of my calumny, but she cannot possibly have found it easy to get a good situation after that. Il n'y a pas d'apparence qu'elle ait après cela trouvé facilement assez bien placée, to place herself in favorable ways. That is, inside another household or economy, obsessed with the rules of taking place, of placement tests, of placing, replacing, and displacing. Looking closer at the description of both theft and trial, there is no place left for this particular thief to occupy. The ribbon's theft turns out to be at odds with the desire to occupy and to identify with places and placeholders tout court. The key scene of a first interrogation, after the easy detection of the ribbon among Rousseau's belongings, shows the way. It is condensed into this sentence. I quote, I grew confused and finally said that it was Marion who had given it to me. Je me trouble et enfin je dis que c'est Marion qui me l'a donné. It was Marion who had given it to me. 2 pages later, Rousseau acknowledges that his love of Marion caused not only his theft of the ribbon, but also his false accusation. Listen. When I accused that poor girl, it is strange but true that my friendship for her was the cause. She was present in my thoughts, and I threw the blame on the first person who occurred to me. I accused her of having done what I intended to do myself. I said that she had given the ribbon to me because I meant to give it to her. Lorsque je chargeais cette malheureuse fille, il est bizarre, mais il est vrai, que mon amitié pour elle en fut la cause. Elle était présente à ma pensée. Je m'excusais sur le premier objet qui s'offrit. Je l'accusais d'avoir fait ce que je voulais faire et de m'avoir donné le ruban parce que mon intention était de le lui donner. These lines ignite and spread confusion after the fact from inside the sentence uttered by Rousseau during the first interrogation. A correct sentence, according to a common understanding of syntactic rules, a sentence at its place and en forme. This sentence: it was Marion who had given it to me. C'est Marion qui me l'a donné. It turns out, though, that this sentence, which at first glance appears complete and at its place, centers on an ellipsis. It says, without quite saying, this: it was Marion who had given it to me. The second it, referring to the idea of stealing and giving the ribbon to her. Elle m'a donné l'idée de lui donner le ruban. The ellipsis, though inserted into the pronoun it, reappears from inside it, ripping it apart, a pronoun no longer able to function as a placeholder for it. An elided L apostrophe in the French text starts oscillating between the reference ribbon and idea. Nothing, no word in general, and in particular inside of what seems to be a given sentence, remains at its place. Nor do names, proper names and names of places, remain at theirs. The one and most irritating sentence that responds to the question of why Marion came to Rousseau's mind when accusing her of theft fails to replace the question by its answer. It states, I quote, "She was present in my thoughts, and I threw the blame on the first person who occurred to me. Elle était présente à ma pensée, je m'excusais sur le premier objet qui s'offrit." Not a person, as the English translation states, but an object, some thing, if not word thing, offered itself when Marion came to mind, reappearing from within my thoughts. She came to mind from afar, yet so close yet from afar, almost at one with the idea of theft when it first approached me in the preceding book. You remember, and I quote, "I learned finally to steal, an idea that had never before come into my head, and one that I have never been able entirely to rid myself of since. J'appris à dérober enfin. Fantaisie qui jusqu'alors ne m'était pas venue, et dont je n'ai pu depuis lors bien me guérir." The idea of theft, à dérober, came from afar, like Marion, and came into my head, not just to visit, but to stay forever, like Marion. And no different from theft, approaching me in company of others from afar. I learned to covert in silence, to conceal, to dissimulate, to lie, and finally, to steal. J'appris à convoiter en silence, à me cacher, à dissimuler, à mentir et à dérober enfin. Marion resurfaced from within my thoughts not as one, nor as the first thing coming to mind, but as a name redoubled by its toponym. I quote, "Marion was a young girl from the Maurienne. Marion était une jeune Mauriennoise. Marion, Maurienne. Marion and Maurienne echo each other no less than the quintessence of theft, dérober, and the particular theft in question here, ruban, or rather dérubant. Marion, Maurienne appear, they reappear too close to each other, a proximity impossible to measure, for the other here is not a given, robbing each other of their mutual shape. Dérobé par moins que dérobant. No name remains en forme, no proper name, no name of places, at its place. Marion and Maurienne turn out too loose, coming too close to one another, withdrawing no less than withdrawn from themselves. The encounter of their porous, phonic, and literal textures leaves no letter, no oral particle intact. It allows for countless incursions, interventions, cuts that never seem to reach semiotic or semantic saturation. Between Marion and Maurienne, you may hear voices whisper, none of them at their place nor at another. Marion, ma reine, mon roi, moi rien, mon mari. In stealing the ribbon, ruban, for whom is Rousseau stealing? Reading. And who Rousseau? For nothing other, I hear myself saying, as if from afar, than the proliferation, one not devoid of pleasure-inducing extensions, detours and prolongations of Purloin's scattered letters, Purloin's scattered sounds. Pour loin, for making distance. Fragmented limbs of a missing marionette, no less than puppeteer. The process of prolongation opens a way to reapproach the theft of the ribbon from a slightly different angle. Rousseau steals, dérobe, the ribbon for no one and for nothing but the ribbon. Though neither for the word nor thing ruban, since an older word stems from within the French word ruban, the Middle French noun prolonge, meaning precisely ribbon. Prolonge, a word fallen out of usage, extends a relation while delaying its consummation, a purloined liaison. This prolonge, reappearing from inside the robbed ribbon, ruban dérobé, as if returning from afar, inconspicuously taking ruban apart and away, may be taken as a prologue to some scattered remarks on the Purloined letter by Edgar Allan Poe. An inconclusive prologue to leave these notes abandoned. Whereas in the first two books of Rousseau's Confessions, the strange complicity of stealing and reading can be decomposed into thematic fragments from a fugue, Poe's short story, The Purloined Letter, seems to investigate the composition of their stretto. The most intimate encounter between reading and stealing in Rousseau's Confessions occurs in the scene about, I quote, Madame Tribu's famous landing library, when la lecture turns into la voleuse, robbing the reader of all activity, including of reading as an act. The place in the Purloined Letter where the discussion about the Purloined Letter takes place, and you will see that the question of taking and of taking place plays a crucial role in the Purloined Letter as well, is not a landing library, but a library nevertheless. I quote, see Auguste Dupin's little back library or book closet at his apartment in Paris. Books held back from public circulation, millions of purloined letters in print stocked away for private use. The affair in question is reported to the anonymous narrator and his friend Dupin in Dupin's little back library one evening by, and I quote, our old acquaintance, Monsieur G., the prefect of the Parisian police. This, in short, I'm cutting out fragments from the prefect's speech to give them away whilst holding back others, is what had happened, and please give special attention to the places, including the word place, and to what takes place or not around the words to take, to place, and to take leave. Now, this is the prefect speaking. I had never received personal information from a very high quarter that a certain document of the last importance has been purloined from the royal apartments. The individual who purloined it is known. This beyond a doubt. He was seen to take it. It is known also that it still remains in his possession. It is clearly inferred from the nature of the document that the paper gives its holder a certain power in a certain quarter where such a power is immensely valuable. The thief is the Minister D. The method of the theft was not less ingenious than bold. The document in question, a letter, to be frank, had been received by the personage robbed while alone in the royal boudoir. Again, Roi and Reine show up without presenting themselves, slightly different though from the reappearance of Ma Reine and Mon Roi from inside Marion Maurienne in Rousseau. I continue to quote. During its perusal, she was suddenly interrupted by the entrance of the other exalted personage from whom especially it was her wish to conceal it. After a hurried and vain endeavor to thrust it in a drawer, she was forced to place it, open as it was, upon a table. The address, however, was uppermost, and the content thus unexposed, the letter escaped notice. At this juncture enters the Minister D. His lynx eye immediately perceives the paper, recognizes the handwriting of the address, observes the confusion of the personage addressed, and fathoms her secret. After some business transactions, he produces a letter somewhat similar to the one in question, opens it, pretends to read it, and then places it in close juxtaposition to the other. Again, he converses upon the public affairs. At length, in taking leave, he takes also from the table the letter, to which he had no claim. Its rightful owner saw, but of course dared not call attention to the act, in the presence of the third personage who stood at her elbow. The minister decamped, leaving his own letter, one of no importance, upon the table. Minister D, the thief, acts as a reader who, I quote, recognizes the handwriting of the address, that is, the proper name and name of place of the sender, withdrawn from visibility only from how the sender had written the name of the addressee. And more precisely, the Minister D acts as a thief. The prefect calls the theft an act only because of his preceding activity as a reader, including the act of pretending to read. The minister turning actor, acting as if actively reading. The reading act precedes the stealing act, that is, taking the letter from the table in the royal boudoir, upon which La Reine had been forced to place it. But the theft at length, or à la longue, does not take place. Why? What happens is this. The reader thief takes the letter, I quote, he takes from the table the letter at the moment of taking leave. At length, in taking leave, he takes also the letter. from the table upon which it had been placed. The words to take and to place relate in such a way as to rip apart the semantic coherence of the commonplace notion taking place. Not only the theft as act, but the very notion to take place does not take place. The way in which to take and to place here relate to each other robs the act of stealing of its active shape because of how the word to take does not take place, but remains robbed of its semantic coherence and self-sameness. Call it identity theft. What happens at length is this: to take the letter, the leave, and to take leave, call for or remind, call to the fore, two different ways of taking. How to take what is called to take here, in order to get hold of the semantic riches of the verb to take, and to act accordingly, without taking leave, by being passively taken away or withdrawn, that is purloined at length, from the desire to take possession, in this case of the word to take. In short, the theft does not take place, for the purloined letter is taken away from a certain place, certainly not its place, at the moment the thief of the leaf takes leave. What remains left when those more or less commonplace notions, to take place, to take a letter, to take leave, entangled at the moment of theft, are robbed of their semantic coherence, are less place and leave and letter than a certain purloining, purloinement. They do not so much occur than undercur, being neither active nor passive, neither leave of absence nor leave of presence, the beginning and end of which remain far from being closed. For whom or what for does the minister D, a reader, a thief, steal the letter in question? Apparently, at least according to the prefect's reading of the theft, driven by the desire to take and keep possession of the letter, if only momentarily, its circulation put on hold, but already in view of its future use inside a politics of economy or an economy of politics. The letter, though, remains purloined from a theft condensed into the title, the purloined letter, which at length did not take place. The letter called purloined will not remain withdrawn from the occasion of being withdrawn again, robbed of its main and most precious characteristics, namely the purloined letter. Over what kind of uneconomy or politics of idiocy does the purloined letter not prevail? For lack of time, I'd like to let some elliptic remarks on the purloined letter take shape before the background of what the outline for this conference has called a politics or economies of reading. At one point in the conversation between the prefect of the Parisian police, representing the police in its policing aspect, and Dupin, we are still in the latter's library, after Dupin's comment on the prefect's remark that the minister had, I quote, been twice waylaid by saying, D, I presume, is not altogether a fool, and if not, must have anticipated those waylayings. The prefect replies, not altogether a fool, but then he is a poet, which I take to be only one remove from a fool. End quote. Nietzsche's nur Narr, nur Dichter may come to mind, and embodied in the minister as a strange crossbreeding of poet and fool. An idiotic politics seems to gain shape. The prefect, embodying a paramilitary aspect of close reading, inside the polis, its emblem being the microscope, proceeds along with his cohort, according to Dupin, as a functionary. Dupin observes, and I quote, "They have no variation of principle in their investigations," end quote. The reason for why the prefect remains unable to detect the purloined letter lies, again, according to Dupin, quote, in the prefect's supposition that the minister is a fool because he has acquired renown as a poet. All fools are poets. This the prefect feels, and he is merely guilty of a non-distributio medii, in sense inferring that all poets are fools, end quote. By taking his feeling for reasoning, the prefect, Dupin seems to conclude, is fooling himself. And Dupin inserts a correctio into the prefect's mystified understanding of the minister. I quote, Dupin, "I know him well. He is both. That is, poet and mathematician." And I continue to quote, "As poet and mathematician, he would reason well. As a more mathematician, he could not have reasoned at all, and thus would have been at the mercy of the prefect," end quote. The minister, though moving inside the political frame, is not just poet and mathematician. He also is, Dupin insists, courtier and intrigant. This fourfold being the most complete portrait of the minister in the purloined letter. Complicit at least in part with the prefect of the police, the minister is a politician, but distinct from the prefect as a functionary who exclusively, if not religiously, is following a given set of principles. The minister, almost its negative, has no principles at all. The minister, again in Dupin's words, near the end, is, and I quote, "an unprincipled man of genius, and thus a monstrum horrendum." His monstrosity lies in that he follows no principle but one, to not follow any principle. The principle of having none. Das Prinzip der Prinzipienlosigkeit. His unscrupulousness marks a negative and scrupulous dependency on conscience. Conscience is the minister's field of expertise. The minister holds on, if only for the moment, to the purloined letter, unaware of what may be called provisionally an idiotic politics. Among its most irritating and uneconomic reading experiences, one might find this, without finding a place for it, without finding the word purloined at its place. That purloined is not the letter's attribute. The letter doesn't own, nor has it earned, the word purloined as its characteristic. It cannot dispose of it, nor get hold of it in view of abandon. Purloined does not belong, neither to the letter, nor to the thief, nor to itself. For whom do we read? I see the question written all over the place, as if listening to a whispered answer from afar, for the clair-obscur of what is called, in what has been exposed as purloined. Pour loin. Thank you.